The Opioid Epidemic by me. Introduction. Drug overdoses have become the leading cause of accidental deaths in the United States. Opioids are strong pain relief medication that could become abused due to its relaxing and euphoric side effects. The opioid crisis emerged as the result of pharmaceutical companies misleading the public, which led to many people misusing the medication and becoming addicted, which also increased the risk of fatal overdoses. How the epidemic began. During the late 1990s, pharmaceutical companies assured the healthcare community that their painkillers were not addictive. Therefore, pharmacists began to prescribe opioids at much higher rates. The frequently prescribed drugs led to widespread misuse of opioids before it was soon observed to be highly addictive. In 2020, it was recorded that 1.6 million people had an opioid use disorder in the past year, according to the Department of Health and Human Services. This is due to how humans realize they become dependent on the effects of their drug after the prescription ends. Addicts are either forced to endure the painful withdrawal symptoms, which include flu-like symptoms, headache, fever, sweating, and vomiting, or they find another means for their high. Further opioid exposure. People that depend on opioids typically resort to other drugs that would satisfy their high. From when the epidemic began, there had been 3 waves of opioid deaths: prescription opioids, synthetic opioids, and heroin. According to the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, the first wave began with increased prescribing of opioids in the 1990s, with overdose deaths involving prescription opioids. The initial cause of the opioid exposure was the escalation of the number of people being prescribed the opioids. Back then, opioids were commonly prescribed for even mild pain, which led to even more exposure to the public. Other drugs were made to replace the pharmaceutical medications, which required a prescription to obtain. Some opioids, like methadone, were developed due to a scarcity of morphine, while others, like heroin, were made in an attempt to make less addictive drugs, but would later be made illegal to produce, according to the Addiction Center. With an estimated 6% of people transitioning to heroin after the misuse of prescription opioids, there's an increased risk for overdose. Furthermore, heroin users face the risk of fentanyl-laced heroin, which is especially dangerous, with the small lethal dose of 1.9 milliliters. As heroin and synthetic opioids surge, a large portion of them are cut with fentanyl. As you can see with this chart, during this time period between 2015 and 2016, the number of deaths including fentanyl doubled. This is an informational video that raises public awareness for opioids. Government prevention. As a result of high overdose deaths and the development of dependency for these drugs, governmental agencies such as the CDC and NIH are combating the opioid epidemic. The CDC supports states and communities by observing outbreaks, monitoring trends, promoting public awareness, and analyzing data to identify which areas require more support. For instance, Overdose Data to Action is a 3-year cooperative agreement through which the CDC funds health departments in 47 states, Washington, D.C., 2 territories, and 16 cities and counties for surveillance and prevention efforts, according to the Centers for Disease and Control and Prevention. As the CDC monetizes treatment centers and health facilities, they treat the suffering patients that experience these opioid addiction and withdrawal symptoms to overcome its presence in the public body. Because opioid dependence has such a detrimental effect on humans, it became clear that opioids became a public safety concern which afflicted many communities. To resolve this public health concern, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services is focusing its efforts on 5 major priorities: improving access to treatment and recovery services, promoting overdose reversing drugs, better public health surveillance, providing support for research on pain and addiction, and better practices for pain management, according to the NIH. These efforts are crucial to the prevention of overdose deaths and the misuse of opioids in society. There have been treatment facilities and awareness programs to promote public health safety and to prevent opioid addiction and its effects to users. For example, in 2017, HHS issued over $800 million in grants to support access to opioid-related treatment, prevention, and recovery services, according to the Department of Health and Human Services. This surplus in funding health departments to treat the opioid epidemic makes it easier for states to receive treatment through their Medicaid programs. Government mistakes. The FDA had failed to undertake a root cause analysis of the regulatory mistakes that contributed to the opioid epidemic. The Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act obliges manufacturers to ensure their product is safe before it is marketed. However, the FDA had not properly enforced this law when it had approved Purdue's pharmaceutical extended-release oxycodone in 1995. Surprisingly, in 2017, the President's Commission in Combating Drug Addiction and the Opioid Crisis found that opioid crisis was caused in part of inadequate oversight by the FDA. Since the Food and Drug Administration had sloppily approved this drug for long-term use, the label featured a broad indication for extended-release oxycodone, which promoted the drug for more common conditions. As a result, other pharmaceutical companies introduced their own opioids into the market after observing Purdue's success, which surged the presence of opioids. To add fuel to the fire, in 2002, the FDA convened an advisory committee of 10 outside experts and asked the broad indication on opioid labels should be narrowed. 8 of these experts advised the FDA to narrow the indication. The opportunity to stop overprescribing for opioids was missed, therefore its use only increased from then on. During the safety trials that the FDA had approved for opioids, there have been reports of respiratory depression, drug diversion, and even death. Negligently, the FDA requires at least 2 randomized controlled trials demonstrating clear efficacy. Yet it approved for extended-release oxycodone based only on 1 adequate and well-controlled study. The FDA utilized a method for proving the efficacy of opioids which established all subjects to psychological dependence for the tested drug, then switching a few of them to placebos, and then they view the results. However, these examples led to inaccurate conclusions about the drug. Conclusion. Pharmaceutical companies reassured the healthcare community that opioids were not addictive or harmful for chronic pain and long-term use. As a result, these drugs became overprescribed for chronic and common pain. Governmental agencies fought back to help prevent the influence of opioid crisis in communities for addicts. The FDA had failed to provide proper regulatory marketing for opioids, which ultimately caused overprescription. My research relates to people affected by opioid addiction in any way as they can know why and how the opioid crisis started and what to do. Victims would be able to understand the details that led to the epidemic and know what the government is doing to address this.